Yeah, everyone. Welcome to our grant writing skills series. This is session number 3, one of the last sessions here. We also have a grant writing retreat coming up. If you guys would love to join, we'd love for you guys to join that as well. Today, we're going to be going over the art of the personal statement, which is a key component of your proposals. And today, we have Jen Green as a special guest to give us a great presentation and great information on your personal statement. Thank you for attending.
Cool, we'll hope it's great information. So hi everybody, sorry for the delay. We were figuring out, they got some sweet new technology up in the writing center. Oh, Angel, do you mind shutting the door? Because I'm super loud, thank you. Okay, so let's talk about the art of the personal statement. This is a really important part, like Angel was saying, of most any grant application that you're gonna be pursuing, fellowship, grant, scholarship, etc. And just a little reminder, if some of the folks are joining us for the first time, our whole goal with this workshop series is professional skills development, ostensibly. So giving you a really solid foundation in grant writing. So the first session we talked about identifying the right funding for you. Last time we talked about how to write about your research in a way that's compelling. And now we're going to talk about how to discuss yourself and your educational and professional journey in a way that's compelling. And be sure to mark those calendars for the grant writing mini retreats that are coming up. This is the last of the 3 workshops where we talk at you. The remaining ones will be your chance to come here to the writing center and work on your stuff and have folks around to answer any questions that you might have while you do work on it, which is kind of nice. A lot of my students find that really, really helpful. So definitely take advantage of that. And just some low-key reassurance here, right? Writing in the first person, I don't think is intuitive for everybody. I actually really enjoy talking about myself. Most people don't. And so I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that. But becoming more comfortable with writing in the first person is going to be like your ninja superpower, because you're going to use it not just for fellowship applications, teaching statements, right? Like if your goal is to go into the professoriate, or you're interested in potentially teaching K-12, anything like that, this can be really helpful in terms of teaching statements. It's different than a teaching statement, but I think, you know, the way you're thinking about your experiences, thinking about your educational and professional trajectory can be really helpful in that regard. I find it super helpful for interviews, you know, having a sense of the very key experiences I've had that really shaped me and who I am as a professional. And I think it's also really helpful in terms of your overall educational and professional planning, right? Because the whole thing with a personal statement is you're thinking about where you've been, what you're doing now, and where you want to go. And so, you know, a lot of times when I'm thinking in these terms, it'll remind me, I'm like, oh, you know, something I meant to do was go speak at this one conference, blah, 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 blah. Like, sometimes it kind of reminds me of the things that I still need to do, as opposed to just the awesome stuff that I've done. Jesse, do we have a question in the chat, or is that you talking? Oh dear.
So we do not have a direct question. There's one from Anamika about signing in, but I'll respond. I'll let you know if we have any. I'm just kind of putting it out there that I can put questions for it if we need to.
Oh, okay, sure. Sorry about that, Jesse.
No worries.
All right, thanks. So the whole purpose of a personal statement is to give reviewers a sense of what drives you, what makes you tick. Makes you tick is a colloquialism that maybe is a little problematic. I had a student he's like, mean, what makes me mad? I was like, no, like what makes you go? Like, what are the things that drive you educationally and professionally? You know, why do you do the things you do in that realm? And something I want everybody to be really cognizant of, a strong personal statement is always, always, always going to be tailored for the specific opportunity you're applying for. So it's not like you're gonna have one version of this and you're just gonna send it out, you know, to the National Institutes of Health. You're gonna send it out for a job opportunity. You're just gonna keep on keeping on. However, I will give you an outline that makes a really solid foundation for whatever type of opportunity you might be applying for if you have to write a personal statement. So I want you to walk away with those tools. I want you to walk away with those mad skills, but I also want you to be really cognizant of the fact that it always needs to be adapted. Oh, we got some echo.
Can you please hide that content?
Pardon?
Can you please hide the thing that you have on the screen?
Get rid of this.
Yeah, maybe minimize that.
Yeah, there we go. Okay. So I am an art historian by training, and so I wanted to like incorporate a little bit of like art history up in this. So this is a Greek or Roman sculpture, somebody doing a face palm. I'm sure it wasn't really meant to be a face palm. It was meant to be like some sort of cool existential thing. But I want everybody to think of it as the face palm, right? Start fresh. I think we've all had a lot of interesting information provided to us about what a personal statement is or isn't. So just kind of take that and set it aside. I think a really common misconception about personal statements is that it has to involve some sort of very tragic thing that happened to you. That's really not where we're going with this. Like, I saw students talking on Slack. Well, okay, students showed me something on Slack because I don't go on Slack because it scares me. But it was like, you gotta have a story. You gotta have a story, something really bad that happened to you. No, not necessarily. In fact, no. It's all in the telling. So I want you all to start fresh. We're all going to put our personal statements that we wrote when we were applying for undergraduate aside, and think about some potentially new ways of doing this. Being authentic is really important. I have a friend who, we all have that friend, right, who is a philosophy major and is like, but Jen, what is authentic? And I was like, okay, no, you know what I mean, right? You want to keep it real to an extent, because it's still a formal piece of writing. It's still a high stakes piece of writing, but being authentic is indeed important. Here we have two images of the French Emperor Napoleon. So these both date to like early 19th century. And on the left, you have Napoleon crossing the Alps during one of his military campaigns. He's on a donkey. He looks beat down. His troops look beat down. It's, freezing cold outside, windy, etc. Not an especially idealized image, whereas that is what you have on the right. The flowing fabric, the white horse rearing up, him in full military regalia. We have a pretty good sense that on the right is not how things actually went down. So that's why I'm saying I want you to lean into what we got on the left a little bit more. Like, some jagged edges are okay. Not everybody's journey is perfectly linear and ideal. Show don't tell. So Jackson Pollock, this is mid 20th century, and the whole idea with Jackson Pollock's paintings is they're fully abstract, right? So you're not seeing any sort of imagery. I always hear somebody say in museums, oh, my 4-year-old could do that wrong. But really what he was doing is he was using motion and color to get you to feel something. And that's your goal with this, is to get the reader to feel something. So that's why I say show don't tell. Rather than saying, hey, I'm an amazing candidate for this fellowship, you're going to show them based on what you know about that fellowship, and how you're telling your story in this particular context. And this one's just a little cheeky, right? So tell your story from a place of power. This is an image. It's a Baroque Italian image by Artemisia Gentileschi, and it's a tale from the Christian Bible of Judith beheading Holofernes, all about like female power, right? So you want to tell your story from a place of power, rather than, hey, these things happened to me and I was kind of like in this role of bystander. You're going to talk about how you went out, you were proactive. Yes, things happened that maybe weren't ideal or wasn't perfectly linear, but you were proactive, you gained this new perspective, and you used that in your future endeavors. So the personal statement is an opportunity to show rather than tell reviewers, right? We talked about showing rather than telling. We can revisit that if any of that's confusing. But it's a carefully curated version of your educational and professional trajectory. You can't talk about all the things, right? So this isn't going to be your resume, like a list of like 30 things that you've done throughout your career. You definitely want to show rather than tell that you have the potential to be a leader in your field. We talked about last time with your research, wanting to show that your research is exciting, that it's interesting, that it's going to push your field forward. This is really about you, the researcher, pushing your field forward and like pushing the research forward and like making a difference, whether you're going into the professoriate, whether you're going to go into industry, whatever the case might be. In fact, that's a good way of looking at this. And I I was supposed to have a slide in here about personal statement versus research essay that I used last time. I forgot it. But think about it this way, the personal statement is about you, the scholar, the researcher, whereas the research statement that we discussed last time is about the research. So, and what I see graduate students do, because you all are shady, okay, is you'll try to use this as like an extra page of your research essay, because you're like, I'm not going to talk about that research, I'm going to keep going. But no, this is about you. You're going to want to show that you bring an uncommon perspective to the next cohort of recipients. You know, basically, what do you bring to the table in terms of diversity? And diversity doesn't necessarily mean in terms of ethnicity. It can mean a lot of different things. But, you know, different parts of your identity, whether you are a non-traditionally aged student, right? You're a little bit older than the rest of your cohort. Maybe you're a parent. Maybe you identify as a student with a disability. Whatever that is that you bring to the table that fits the narrative you're hoping to establish, it's important for them to know those kinds of things to the extent that you're comfortable talking about it. And you definitely want to show them that you have plans for the future and you're a safe bet. Folks always kind of skirt that future part. And I really want you to talk both about where you're going with your education and where you hope to go professionally once you've completed your education. You know, think like 5 to 10 years into the future after you finish your degree, whatever degree you happen to be working on right now. You know, students always want to avoid that part because they're like, but Jen, what if I don't actually do that? That's okay. This is a snapshot of where you're at as of the day you hit the submit button on that application. They know your plans are going to change. But if you don't talk about your plans at all, that definitely doesn't present you as a safe bet. So you want to show them that you have a master plan as of the day you hit that submit button and you're ready to do the thing. If your thing changes, you know, I'm not going to come along in 10 years and take away your ACLS Mellon fellowship for, you know, dissertation writing. Okay, and I can't, how do I make, does anybody know how I make this disappear? Is there, all right, y'all, I don't know how to make it disappear, and I've already had enough technical difficulties. But for the folks who are here in the room, the personal statement is not your resume and narrative form. We talked a little bit about that. You really want to avoid melodrama or negativity. You know, you don't want to approach things from a deficit mindset. So a good example is, well, I, you know, went to a small regional university and I didn't have the chance to take any of the classes that I wanted to take. Wrong. So what you're going to say is, I was especially proactive in seeking out opportunities to learn about this thing because I knew that it was something I was going to pursue in grad school. You know, so even though courses weren't offered, I took courses through a community college or whatever. You see what I'm showing how you were tenacious, how you were proactive, you weren't just a bystander. It's definitely not about the award you're applying for, it's about you. And it's certainly not about why, you know, like I'll often see almost like a list of reasons that the person deserves the award. That's not what it's about. And, you know, and again, you're showing through some carefully selected experiences from your educational and professional trajectory, you're showing that you're the person they're looking for. It's not a continuation of your research statement. This is tricky too. It's not about friends, family members. You know, a lot of times I will get like at least a paragraph into an essay and I realize the writer hasn't even talked about themselves yet. It's about, you know, maybe a parent's journey or grandparent or whoever. Now, that being said, these things all play into, you know, your personal experiences play into your educational and professional experiences and choices. I get that. But it could be about how you experience this. So a really good example, I had a student who, when he was growing up, his mom was a single mom. She was college aged when she had him. And, you know, she decided to go get her education at a local community college while she was also working at McDonald's, you know, but he told us that through his eyes, how he experienced it. So he started out with, and it was about like how she always prioritized education, you know, his education. And he started out by talking about one of his first memories being his mom sitting in her McDonald's uniform studying at the kitchen table and how he processed that as education is important, you know, and that was the messaging she was giving him. And then he started talking about himself, but it was like a little glimpse into where he was coming from, his mom's story, but it was told through his eyes. And you're going to want to think about how personal you want your personal statement to be. And, these things can vary culturally quite a bit too. I think in the United States, particularly if you're writing for a US audience, we get reasonably personal, but there's limits to that. You really do need to think about how vulnerable you want to be. And you also need to think, am I telling this for the sake of telling this, or does it fit the narrative that I'm hoping to establish? Uh-oh. Whoopsie daisy, went a little too far. So I want y'all to do some quick reflection. We're gonna take like a hot second, shake it out. What I advise folks to do before they start working on personal statements is think about some of the things they want to show rather than tell the reviewers about them. Like before we go into what the actual content of a personal statement will be and how you'll organize that content, I want you to kind of think about some traits that you want to show rather than tell the reviewer about you, because this might help you as you shape that narrative, because all the parts need to relate to the whole, right? Your opening and the body of the document where you're talking about some specific formative experiences, when you're talking about where you want to go in the future, all those parts should relate to each other. So I found, hopefully this is helpful. I've only had one group of students who for whatever reason it was not helpful. They took it in a totally different direction. Long story. But think about, some words or phrases that you would like the reviewer to walk away knowing about you. So for me, I applied for a Fulbright award for higher education professionals to go overseas, right? And specifically, it was to go to Japan and learn about the Japanese university system. And so the things that I really tried to emphasize as I was showing rather than telling, I wanted them to know that I'm really intellectually curious. Global perspective is extremely important to me. And adaptability is also something that I pride myself on, like adaptability and problem solving. These all happen to be things that they are looking for, so I was keeping that in mind as I was trying to think about some of the takeaways that I wanted the reviewers to have. And so I told them, I didn't tell them, I showed them these things, through some specific examples from my educational and professional trajectory. I dug deep, y'all. I went back to my very first experience overseas on my undergraduate study abroad program. Fast forward, now I'm working in international education, and at that time I was running study abroad programs, right? So obviously that was something I talked about. So enough about me though. I want you to take a few minutes, and think about some words or phrases, 2 or 3, any part of speech, whatever, that you would want the reviewer to walk away knowing about you. So you're going to keep these things in mind when you're kind of thinking about the overall tone and structure of your essay. So I'll give you a few minutes. So circling back, I'm wondering if anybody would be willing to share their words or phrases. Anybody out in cyberspace or anybody here in the room, just so we have an example.
I found a couple of phrases.
Sure.
The first one is research benefits society.
Ooh, okay. Research benefits society. So basically an altruistic approach to your research. That's hot. That's perfect. Keep going.
And then a few phrases like innovative.
Innovative.
And then creative.
Creative. Okay. And for yours, you'll just have to be careful that you're talking about you as the researcher rather than the research, because those are terms that can apply to both. But that's a great start. I love it. Those are all things especially if you're applying for an award to fund your research, they're going to want to know those things, that you as a scientist, that you think like a scientist, you're interested in, the impact of your research, not only on your field, but on society, and that you're innovative and creative as a researcher. That's great. Anyone else want to share? Jesse, do we have anybody in cyberspace who wants to share?
They're being real quiet in the chat so far, so none yet. Hopefully
That's
they do put some in
okay.
there.
That's okay. I keep seeing the little number on the chat go up, so I'm like, somebody show me some love. I'm gonna wait this uncomfortable silence out just a little bit more. But the example we have from here in the room was pretty solid, more than solid, awesome.
I think I have something.
Oh, you have something? Yes, tell me.
You got one?
Oh, we have somebody in the room too, Jesse. We'll do this one in the room and then we'll hit cyberspace.
Yeah, do both.
Awesome.
Okay, so the first one will be like, well, because it's what I want them to take from me, like to know about it.
But you want them to know about you,
Yeah.
yep.
So the first one will be hard work.
Hard work.
Yes. The second one will be like the fact that I never give up or never give in.
Never give up, okay.
And out of the box thinking.
Out of the box thing. These are all great too. You know, and it's always going to depend a little bit on the award you're applying for, but you all both brought up some pretty good stuff that could apply in a lot of situations. Then you just have to think of how you're going to share some specific examples of experiences where you demonstrated those qualities. Jesse, you want to hit cyberspace for me?
Yeah, Arlene was kind enough to share with us her phrase would be ethics-oriented and responsive researcher.
Arlene, thank you. Arlene and I have worked together before, so I really appreciate her taking one for the team. But those are all super awesome. You know, but again, as graduate students, always be aware that you're talking about yourself, the researcher, as opposed to the research. I think as a graduate student, it's really easy to kind of almost start to define yourself by your research, and you kind of forget about yourself as the researcher. And, you know, again, not to blame grad students too much, because I was one once, but like, particularly if you're maybe not as comfortable speaking in the first person, I will totally see people low-key use the personal statement to keep talking about their research. But those are all great examples. You know, and that's, like I said, that kind of gets the ideas flowing, and then you start thinking about how you would bring in the specifics with that. So I want to give you all a suggested structure for your personal statement. This is ostensibly I don't want to say foolproof, but like, this has been working for us. I'm not gonna lie. I use this one with my students at Stony Brook University out on the East Coast, and my UTEP students have been using it. And it's a pretty tried and true approach to the personal statement that I stole from an English professor who stole it from another English professor, etc. So if you start out, I would say roughly your first paragraph. I like to look at this as like a magic 4-paragraph essay. If it's a 1-pager, if it's a little longer, then obviously you're going to have to recalibrate. But your first paragraph ostensibly is going to be your hook. You know, describing how you got interested in the things that drive you academically. I'll go into a little bit more about the hook, but this is a chance to do some storytelling, have a little fun with it. It doesn't have to be when you were 5. Hopefully it's not last week that you got interested in what you're doing in graduate school. But I've seen a lot of different approaches to it. You know, I mentioned when I wrote my own Fulbright application, I used my study abroad experience as an example. And you know, bear in mind, I went on study abroad when I was 19. I was writing the Fulbright application when I was in my late 30s. But it was a fun way to start it based on that award. You know, and initially, my mom signed me up for study abroad. I didn't want to go. I was terrified. I didn't want to admit that I was terrified. I also had this boyfriend in college that my parents didn't like. So they were like, oh, let's send her to Germany. That'll solve that really quickly. And it did. And it changed my whole educational and professional trajectory while we were at it. You know, like my parents were thinking very short term, but it ended up having really long-term effects. And I'll give some examples of other hooks that I've seen when we go into the hook specifically. That's usually the part that folks are not as familiar with, but like I said, have a little fun with it. You know, again, you don't have to reach back to when you were 5 years old, but again, I would hope it's not last week. A lot of folks, their hook maybe started, you know, they got interested in the things that they got interested in maybe high school, or, you know, as graduate students, maybe it was as an undergraduate that you got excited about something, but maybe it really was when you were 5, and that's okay too. The transition to substance, this is like low-key gonna be the last sentence of your hook where you're transitioning to the body of the document. So we're moving away from maybe some of the more like fun storytelling piece of this, and then we're moving into that part where you're talking about these very key experiences. And again, you're choosing those very key experiences based on the narrative you're trying to tell for a particular award. So and I put A, B, and C. This will amount to roughly 2 paragraphs. So you've got your hook is 1 paragraph. The body of the document is going to be about 2 paragraphs. And again, this is on the assumption that it's a 1-page personal statement. Sometimes they'll throw a wrench into the plans and ask you for more. Sometimes they might even ask you for less, and that's super tough. But a couple of key experiences, I would say like 2 or 3. To me, 3 is the magic number. And so in my case, when I was working on that Fulbright application, like I said, I talked about how I went from being a study abroad student myself to managing study abroad programs in my career. And then at that time, I was transitioning into my role as a fellowships advisor. So I talked about where I wanted to take it from there as a fellowships advisor. I talked about being a relatively new fellowships advisor and curious to learn more. And then kind of went into what my future goals were in international education as a way of showing them, that I had this key theme running throughout the essay. And then your conclusion, this is the last paragraph of your essay, and this is where you can talk about your educational and professional plans. And to really challenge yourself to not just talk about, where you're going with your education. Think like 5 to 10 years out once you've finished your degree. So say you're a PhD student, where do you want to be 5 to 10 years after that? What do you actually want to do for your job? I think as graduate students, y'all are pretty okay with talking about where you're at educationally. It's when I bring in the professionally piece that you're like, ooh, don't know if I want to go there. But remember that you're not signing your name in blood. They know that this will change, that your plans will evolve. It's a snapshot of where you're at when you submit the application. Any questions about the sweet outline before I go into the hook a little bit more? Oh, I forgot something really important, y'all. And I realized I gave this presentation to another group the other day, and I think I messed it up. With the body of the document, tell this in chronological order, right? So the hook, you're reaching back to when you first got interested in something, and then the body of the document where you're talking about these specific experiences, you'll notice I did it in chronological order. I just didn't tell you that I was doing it in chronological order. So I had my hook where I reached back to my undergraduate study abroad. And then I talked about how I'd been working managing study abroad programs, how I had just transitioned to a role in fellowships advising and was getting my start there and kind of building on my background in international education, because so many of these do involve overseas experiences. And then I went on to the conclusion where I talked about my future educational and professional plans. Sometimes they'll do something a little sneaky with you too, where you have to write a statement of purpose, which I mentioned this last time. A lot of times what they're getting at is it's low-key kind of a personal statement and a research essay or statement of purpose. So, but we're talking just about the personal statement, but I started to deviate and I was like, wait a minute, no, we're not going there today. So when they're looking for a straight up personal statement, this is a pretty foolproof way of approaching it. And remember, all the parts have to relate to the whole, right? So sometimes, actually, I'm gonna go back quick. Sometimes I'll have somebody who comes up with this like really amazing hook, but it doesn't relate to the body or the conclusion at all. And I'm like, oh, maybe for a different document, maybe for a different award. But the hook needs to set you up to tell this story. And again, think of it as where you've been, what you're doing now, and where you want to go. And tell that body part in that body part. Tell the body. I would organize the body of the document into in chronological order. Sorry, that was do it in chronological order. It's much easier for the reviewer to follow along. When people bounce around, like a lot of times folks want to get fancy and maybe talk about this in terms of like, they're trying to show these different traits and they're like bouncing around. That doesn't work for me. I'm pretty orthodox. And I've also reviewed for stuff at the national level and seen how other people react to it. I think chronological order is the way to go. I mean, you could see the whole document moves in chronological order, but the body in particular, I would, when you talk about those key experiences, I would keep that in mind. A little bit more about the hook. You're grabbing the reader's attention, creating an interest to learn more. When you think about it, reviewers have stacks of these applications. When I've reviewed, I think the least I've ever had, I had 30 recently, and I was like, yay, I only have 30 applications. I've reviewed for other awards where I haven't had as many as like 60 or 70. So giving them a little something memorable to give them a sense of who you are Nothing wrong with that. It invites the reader into the narrative, into a specific moment. Active, vivid, specific, but not melodramatic. Like I said, just a little bit of storytelling. Reveals something substantive about who you are. And, I think the establishing a focus for the rest of the narrative is really important. If it doesn't leave you anywhere to go, that makes sense based on what you're applying for. Like I said, you may have to put that hook on the proverbial shelf and use a different one. So just a few more examples of hooks. I don't share essay examples because I think it's really important, particularly with a personal statement. You're writing this as you, and I think it's really easy to get influenced by somebody else's tone or approach. But I had a great one from a graduate student who was applying for a Fulbright to do his dissertation research overseas. And he was a history PhD student. And in the hook, he talked about this moment where he was like in the 3rd grade and he brought his report card home to his parents. And there was a note from the teacher that he'd been reading lots of books about World War II, and she was so excited to see his interest in history, and she thought she had a budding historian on her hands. So fast forward, and he's transitioning, to talking about some key educational and professional experiences. He is, an undergraduate. He's studying history. He's learning all sorts of research methods. And then he talks about moving on to graduate school and how he's gotten even more sophisticated with his research. He was from Orange County in California. He was one of the only students in his high school who identified as Hispanic, and he talked about how, he thinks that that's how he got interested in looking specifically at history through the lens of like place and identity. And that's what his research in Mexico was about for his dissertation. And he, also talked a lot about the mentors who had guided him through that, as he, made his research agenda more sophisticated, more specific. And so he tied it all together, talking about how, he was going to finish his PhD using, the research that he was doing in Mexico. And then he wanted to go on and be a professor himself. And he wanted to influence students the way his 3rd grade teacher influenced him. It might sound a little cheesy, like a little too convenient, to go in that direction, but man, it worked. It really worked. But he also had to go through multiple drafts of it to get it to a point where it didn't maybe sound a little melodramatic or a little almost forced, a little silly. But that was a really good one that I had from a graduate student that I enjoyed. This one was an undergrad, but I think this works. So let's do a science example now. He was a biomedical engineering student. He's also applying for Fulbright. All my good examples come from Fulbright because my students get really creative with these personal statements. So he was telling a story about how at his bar mitzvah, he got his first microscope from his grandmother who had been a scientist at Pfizer. So like in the 80s when no women were scientists at Pfizer, so he's showing this idea of his grandmother as a mentor in STEM. He's also telling us about his identity as Jewish, because he's talking about how it was for his bar mitzvah that he got this microscope, and then he takes us on his journey through undergrad with his research and how he developed as a researcher through his undergrad. He was getting ready to apply for graduate school. So then that last part of it in the conclusion was about, the type of graduate program he wanted to, be a part of, and what was going to drive his research agenda going forward. Now his research probably totally changed, and that's okay. But he needed to have some sort of a plan. Any questions about the hook, about the structure, the suggested structure that I've laid out?
I have a question.
Sure.
It's just that I am reapplying for a scholarship, so I guess it should be written differently, right?
Oh, sorry, you said you're reapplying?
Reapplying to a scholarship that I already got.
Oh, okay.
So probably the structure is a bit different, especially at the beginning. I should thank them probably and say how much it helped me.
Okay, so
That's
this is a good question. I'm reapplying to a scholarship that I've already received. Should I approach it differently? At the end of the day, always look to the prompt. A lot of times it'll say the personal statement and they'll give you some of the things they want you to specifically address.
They just say about like goals and like very, very general.
Just go right, okay, so, and you'll see that a lot, where it's like, just go right.
Yeah.
Sometimes you'll see like this massive bullet list of things they, bulleted list of things they want you to make sure you cover. What I would do is rather than like thanking them explicitly, because remember, this isn't a letter. It's not a cover letter. So you're not addressing it to anybody. I would also suggest that you not start it by saying, hello, my name is blah, blah, blah. They already know your name. But you also don't want to assume that they've read other parts of your application. They do know your name, but they don't assume that, they're cross-referencing between the personal statement and the research essay. You want to always look at them as like two standalone essays that work together as parts of a whole. I digress, but I'm getting there. So what I would do is when you're talking about your educational and professional trajectory and some of the key experiences, you could be like, I received this scholarship to do this thing and it's changed everything. And now here's where I'm going, in the future. Does that make sense?
Yeah, because I started like just saying like, oh, how much I'm thankful for it and how much I did with the money, but yeah, I don't feel right about it.
Do your hook, man. Do a cool storytelling about you situation. And then as you're talking in the body about those key experiences.
Should be like an update.
Yeah. One of your key experiences is going to be receiving that scholarship.
Okay.
And the cool stuff you've done because of it.
Because I have another question following
Sure.
that. Is like, so they are reading my new personal statement, right? They will also read the last one to compare them or something? Or they won't remember, so I should write more details?
I would not assume if you're reapplying for something, whether it's something you applied for and got and you're reapplying if they allow it, or if it's something you applied for and you didn't get, don't assume that there's gonna be any sort of institutional memory. Unless it is like a really small local organization, typically, they're not going to remember what you wrote the last time.
Okay.
And I definitely don't think they'll fault you for updating it rather than just submitting the same document that you submitted last time. I would hope that they will, even if they haven't seen the previous one, they'll appreciate that there's some new information there because they want to know how you're using their money, absolutely.
So acknowledge that it's the second time I'm applying, but also make something cool.
Make something cool and new, why not? Why not? And it's good practice for you, for the next thing that comes along, to push yourself a little bit more than submitting what you submitted last year with maybe like a slight change. Really try to get into the mode that these things are going to be tailored each time you apply for something, for what you're applying for in that particular situation. The more tailored they can be, the better. But I think a point that you got me thinking about is, remember, you're not going on and on about the award. I mean, I've read personal statements where people didn't even mention the award, right? Like, we know you're applying for the award. It kind of depends on the setup and the prompt that you got. But especially if they leave it wide open, and they're giving you carte blanche to kind of do what you want to do and need to do with the document. Oh, where'd that go? Then I think, let's see. Oh, what did I do? Oh, I can fix, I think. All right, y'all, I can't fix. I don't know where it went. But yeah, and remember, you're not going on and on about the award. You're talking about you. So I think in your situation, especially opening with that's more about the award than about you. So weave the award into the story you're telling.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, like inside my, like in the experience part, and not about like why it's so important.
When you're talking about the key experiences and you're discussing them in chronological order, then you'd be like, hey, and then I got this scholarship and it was this watershed moment that really helped me, etc.
Okay, yeah, I got it now.
So the hook goes in the first paragraph, or you like kind of mix up everything?
The hook goes in the first paragraph, and like the hook's where you're kind of taking it way back to like when you first got interested in these sorts of things. I sometimes refer to it as your aha moment when you're like, this is what I love to do, right? And then you're going to, that like last sentence of the hook is going to set you up to transition into the body of the document where you're talking about some specific experiences. The body, I would start maybe with undergrad, but like if you're in grad school, keep the focus on graduate school. But undergrad's still a part of that story. It's just like if students are in undergrad, I'm like, okay, I don't want to read about high school anymore. If you talk about high school in the hook, that's cool. But like, we want a sense of what you've done more recently. And then that last paragraph is going to be looking toward the future. But your body of the document will end up, like I said, 2 or 3 really key things you're gonna discuss, because you've got roughly about 2 paragraphs to do it. Thank you. I don't know where those went, all of a sudden Microsoft Teams is up, and I'm like, oh, no, thank you. Any other questions about the book and the outline?
Yeah, sometimes it feels like superficial, but you told us to be authentic, then how do you kind of balance these two?
Funny you should ask about balance, because here, so like with the tone of the essay, it's definitely a balancing act, right? And you notice I have the note on here, keep writing, getting feedback and revising. That's how you're gonna strike the right tone. Because you're right, it can sound a little superficial, a little cheesy, but your goal is to be authentic, but you only have a page, and you also want it to be memorable. And so I always tell students, like, just keep trying stuff out and come to the writing center and get feedback on it. Sometimes your dissertation advisor is not the best person to get feedback from on a personal statement. I can always tell when a dissertation advisor has gone hard on a personal statement, because it will be more about the research than about the researcher in a lot of cases. So they may or may not be your best resource. You'll kind of have to see. I think as far as the personal statement, the writing consultants here are going to be really important to helping you strike that tone. You know, another thing I get asked a lot is, well, I don't want to sound arrogant, but clearly I need to show rather than tell that I'm qualified, right? And that I fit the criteria for who they're looking for. You know, again, these are all things that you're gonna figure out by writing, getting feedback. Dr. Herman from the Writing Center, he's the director, he always says, you're never done with it. There's just a day where you have to submit it. and my students who've written some really outstanding things tell me they work on it a little bit each day. You know, they're not sitting down the day before the deadline trying to bang it all out. You know, they start months in advance and they work on it a little bit at a time, get feedback, incorporate the feedback, you know, get some more feedback. It's a process for sure. Most of my students, when they're working on something like this, will go through maybe like at least 5 or 6 drafts. So I think that's just my opinion. I really think that's how you strike the tone that you're comfortable with. You know, it's supposed to be personal, but how personal? You know, you want the essay to be personal, but it's also still a formal and high stakes piece of writing. You know, and so I don't necessarily have a way to tell you how to do it. I think the big key is revising and showing it to other people. And remember too, the more people you show it to, the more feedback you're gonna get, and the more feedback you have to incorporate. Like you have, or let's not say incorporate, you don't have to incorporate, you can stick to your guns, right? But it's the more feedback you're gonna have to manage. So recently I was working on a piece of writing, and it was actually for the UTEP president. So like I'm nervous already, right? But she shows it to all these people. And I'm like, and I get all this feedback back, and I'm like, where do I even start with this? So like I first had to decide how much of this am I going to use? And this is from like her friends. So I'm like, this is an extreme example. Like, so I first decided what I was going to use and what I was going to set aside. And then I had to think about how I was going to use it and where I was going to incorporate it. Because sometimes, you know, where they suggested I put it, I was like, you know, you have to manage it, because you're not going to just take somebody else's feedback and run with it. You got to decide how comfortable you are. So actually with a personal statement, at least that wasn't a personal statement, right? But it did involve some things that I've done at UTEP, like we're proposing to do some things based on some stuff that already happened. So yeah, the more people you show your stuff to, the more you're going to have to manage the feedback. But you do want to get feedback, and you do want to keep revising throughout. Let's see, and then I missed one back here. So some do's and don'ts. You want to show that you have what it takes by describing some key experiences. We've you know, hit that on the head a couple of times, but you don't want to straight up tell the reviewer why you deserve the award. Remember to take the reviewer along for the ride. This is really important. So in your head, you've lived all this. This is all lived experience, and a lot of times, I think when we're writing about lived experience, we'll leave out some key details that people need to know. An example of this is, you know, when my students, particularly my undergraduates, are talking about like when they came to UTEP, they usually start the body of the document with that. They won't even use the name University of Texas at El Paso. And I'm like, this is a national audience reading this. You totally gotta lay it down. Like the only thing I think would be assumed is your name. You don't have to tell them your name, but you do need to bring them along for the ride. Or if there's acronyms you're using that are specific to UTEP, like the Campus Office for Undergraduate Research Initiatives or CURI, they're not gonna know what CURI is if you just drop the acronym. So always take them along for the ride. And just as good practice, even if you're applying for something internal, don't assume that they know anything. Because there are definitely people at UTEP that do not know what CURI is, and that's a thing. But like, assuming the reviewer will get it is always a risky proposition. And I think also when talking about the border region, when talking about El Paso, when talking about the fact that you're at a leading Hispanic serving university, right? Like, these are not things that people in the rest of the country understand. So and having moved here relatively recently from New York, I will tell you, not something that people understand. So you want to, again, make sure you're bringing them along for the ride. Just a reminder, to tell your story from a place of power rather than telling it with a deficit mindset. And I use the example of, in high school, I didn't have any of the classes I wanted to take, or in undergrad, I didn't have any of the classes I wanted to take. Woe is me, this all happened to me and I was just sitting there watching it happen. That's not what we want. We want to see how you were, proactive, or how something gave you a unique perspective. And I never want to diminish anyone's trauma or misfortune, but you want to be careful how you use it. Because again, your personal story does inform your educational and professional trajectory, but it's not, it doesn't define you necessarily, and it's about where you went, like I said, the perspective you gained, maybe you became more tenacious in seeking out opportunities, that kind of thing. And be really strategic about what you choose to highlight rather than giving us your whole resume and narrative form. That's why I had you do the exercise with the 3, words or phrases about yourself, so you can kind of start to narrow it down. Because clearly everybody's done lots of super awesome things, and ideally we'd be able to tell them all of them, but particularly when it's the 1-page personal statement, that's not going to work out. So I am going to go ahead and have Angel talk about the incentives for the grant writing skills series. And what's cool is you can do this over the course of several semesters. Yes. Like, it doesn't all have to be done in one semester. So if any of you are just joining us, there's still opportunity.
Yes, so if you get to attend all 3 grant writing workshops, this is session 3, of course. If you attended all 3 and at least 1 grant writing mini retreat, and a visit with me, I'm the coordinator for student success and fellowships of the graduate school, then you get to submit your application for earning a bookstore gift card. And so there's still an opportunity for that to come to our grant writing retreats as we've been speaking of. We have the dates, and you could, of course, RSVP through Mind Tracker, and we'd be glad to have you all. And so there's 3 workshops. We'll have them probably every semester. So this is the 3rd one here, and we're still gonna have the mini retreats. So if you guys would love to join us, we'd be glad to have you.
So does the big writing retreats count, or it has to be the mini?
Yes, you have to at least attend 1 grant writing mini retreat. Yes. Mm-hmm.
The mini retreats are kind of nice. I think there used to be one big one. I like the idea of the mini retreats because it's bite-sized. Because I really do think a key part of this is just working on it a little bit at a time. So we're taking these mini retreats for a test drive. And I forgot to explain probably a really important part of this. So I'm just a guest speaker. I was all taken aback by the fact that the tech wasn't working. I work mostly with undergraduates unless I have graduate students who are interested in the Fulbright student program or the National Science Foundation Graduate Research Fellowship specifically. Any other questions about internal funding specific to UTEP for graduate students, those will go to Angel. And we flashed the contact information just disappeared, but the grad fund at utep.edu is how you reach Angel. But if anybody's interested in the Fulbright and or the NSF GRFP specifically, so Fulbright is funding to go overseas and do research. Unfortunately, that is limited to US citizens because it's funded by the State Department. The National Science Foundation Graduate Research Fellowship, as indicated, is limited to STEM, so science, technology, engineering, math, but also social sciences, and it is limited to US citizens or permanent residents. The Fulbright you can apply for almost any time in your career up until you have a PhD in hand. The NSF GRP, once you entered a graduate program, you can apply in your first year or your second year, but that is it. So if anybody's interested in those specifically, that's my email. I'm also going to be kicking off a whole bunch of information sessions throughout March, April, and even that very first week of May about those opportunities specifically. But yeah, unless you're doing those, you're with Angel instead of with me. Those are my only areas of overlap with graduate students. So any questions? We've had some really good ones so far. Thank you to all the people in person holding down the fort. I appreciate you. Jesse, it's so funny to see like, oh wait, no, that's Angel. I was like, is that disembodied hand of Jesse doing these things? Anybody out in cyberspace with questions? Or you can turn your microphone on and keep it pretty cash.
Yeah, none posted yet, but I'll invite anyone that has questions. If you want to come off of mute or type it in the chat, feel free to do so.
In the meantime, while folks consider that, we have one here in the room.
Yes, so a lot of times like they give you question prompts and they have like limits on how many words you can write. So how to deal with those kind of.
Oh, so you're saying if they give you prompts for the personal statement and a page limit, like how do you manage that?
Yeah, like word limits. Kind of.
Oh, word limits. Okay, well that's why I've used like a one-page personal statement is a pretty good example of what they're going to be giving you. You know, like they, you know, again, they may shake it up and give you more space to work with, or even less. If they give you less space, you may not be able to talk about as many key experiences, or you'll have to talk about them a little more briefly. If they give you more space, you can grab a few more key experiences that you've had. But yes, always keep the prompt in mind. You know, again, we're trying to give you some basic skills that, you know, will work for most anything you're applying for. They'll always throw something in random though, you know, for certain opportunities, like, you know, there may be something specific that they want you to address in the personal statement. So you'd have to adjust your outline a little bit for that. But, you know, and if the prompts are so specific that you find the outline I gave you all hard to use, make your own outline. You know, again, I always recommend chronological order if you can swing it. But you can make your own outline. Like outlining is a really, really valuable tool to map out your ideas without writing full sentences and committing to writing a full piece of prose. I don't think it's as actively taught. Like when I was learning to write, that was the thing, was outlining. But really what it is mapping out like what's going to go where, and you can do it with bullet points. You know, you don't have to have complete sentences, full thoughts. It's a really cool way to try out, I think, particularly the organization of a document without committing to the full thing. So you could always tweak that outline as needed, or, you know, come up with your own sort of structure if the prompts were really, really specific.
And I have like one more final question.
Sure.
So a lot of, I'm applying to one scholarship and it's based on something, but the questions they ask you, so they don't give an opportunity to talk about the scholarship. It has to be more personal.
Okay, so the question is, the way the prompts are for this particular award, it doesn't give me the chance to talk about the award, just to talk about myself. Yeah. That's really what they're looking for. They're trying to keep you from going on and on about the award. Like I told you, sometimes I challenge students to not even mention the award. You know, it depends on what you're working on. Like with Fulbright, I'm like, they have a separate research essay. So I'm like, where you talk about like what you want to do on the Fulbright. So I'm like, in the personal statement, I don't even want you talking about Fulbright. I want you talking about you. So low key, that's what they're trying to force you to do, is not talk about the award or why you deserve the award, right? Like telling rather than showing. I think they're low key trying to get you to do a lot of the stuff we just talked about today, which makes me feel totally validated. So yeah, sounds like you got some stuff you're working on.
Yeah, it's a big scholarship.
What is it?
So it's Quad Fellowship.
Oh, Quad Fellowship. Okay, that's cool. That is a relatively new one. So follow their prompts, but I hope this organization helps. And especially for something like the Quad, I think this will help.
Thank you. And we do have some in the chat. Yes.
So we have a question here from Arlene asking, do you have any suggestions for adapting this to a 3-minute blurb about ourselves for new professional acquaintances?
Okay, so Arlene, I think is low-key asking about what we might refer to as the elevator pitch. So like when introducing yourself to new contacts in your field, I think you could, but it's gonna be like streamlined, right? And what I always find when I'm talking to people, like introducing myself, trying to talk about what I do and like why it's important, I wander a lot. So I think you could use, Arlene, I think you could use that structure, like, only you probably would want to start with like, I'm Arlene, and here's the research that I'm working on. I first got interested in this because of blah, blah, blah. And I've had some experience doing these couple of things, like Arlene, I know you're teaching a grant writing course, something unique about you that you could bring up. And then I would probably just wrap it all up with, well, don't wrap it, okay. Okay, start out with who you are, what you do, why it's important. So actually, Arlene, this is gonna be a little bit of like a Frankenstein situation of the research essay and the personal statement. So I would really start with like who you are, what you do, why it's important. And I do a little bit about like your journey in that particular area and a little bit about where you're hoping to go. So like a little bit from last time and a little bit from this time. I'm not necessarily an expert on elevator pitches because I struggle myself. Like I want to talk to them for like 20 minutes about what I do. But I think like having like a quick structure in your head, who you are, what you do, why it's important, how you got to this point, and a little bit about where you want to go. I think that could be a pretty good setup. In fact, you're lucky if you have 3 minutes. Usually it's like a minute at most. Like if you're talking to somebody at a networking event, you gotta make it happen. And like nobody wants to get trapped where they're listening to somebody talk about something. And I think another good tip for me would be to ask them, oh, how did you get interested in the work you do, right? Like show some interest in them as well, rather than just talking about yourself, because I think it can kind of help to keep the conversation going, especially if you don't know them at all and you don't know anything about them. If I have access to somebody's bio beforehand, I'm gonna try to get cute with that and like ask them about something specific. I hope that's remotely helpful.
Yes, it's super helpful. Thank you, Jen.
Okay, thank you, Arlene. You're always so good at me.
I'll also throw out, that's some great advice. We have some resources on elevator pitches and introductions and things like that in our conference basics presentation that is recorded online and coming up later on. So if you want a little bit more on that, Arlene, you can check our recorded session or attend the live version coming up later this semester, because we'll talk a bit about that.
Thank you all so much for being here and learning about personal statements. Like I said, I love talking about myself, but I think the consensus for most of my students is they don't like talking about themselves. But y'all are kind of awesome, so I hope you lean into that and start working on speaking in the first person.